Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking to you about vaccinations. But I'm just going to start off by talking about immunity in general. So there are different types of immunity that you can have. So, the immunity that we are most familiar with is natural active immunity. Natural active immunity is the immunity that you've learnt about where you become infected with a particular pathogen, and then after infection you have phagocytes and lymphocytes, and they produce antibodies, and then they produce memory cells, and then those memory cells provide you with natural active immunity against a particular disease. The reason that it's called active is because you have to do something. You have to produce the antibodies. You have to produce. You have to undergo all the mitosis and do all the stuff. Natural passive immunity is different. Essentially, you don't do anything. So an example of this would be breastfeeding between mother and child, because when you're born, your mother produces breast milk that contains antibodies. So when you drink her breast milk, you are then protected by her antibodies against any particular pathogens that might be in the environment. Now, passive immunity like this is only short term because your body will break down those antibodies because they're foreign to you, and so it doesn't last very long. Artificial immunity is also split into active and passive. Passive artificial immunity is when you are injected with antibodies. So say, for instance, you had a disease that was going to kill you so quickly that you wouldn't have time to find the correct B cells and to make all the antibodies and to get better. Scientists could just inject you with those antibodies, and usually they've grown those antibodies in another animal, like a horse, for instance. They usually use horses because horses are nice and big, they're quite robust, they've got loads of blood, they can deal with having a little bit of an infection, and they can deal with losing a little bit of blood. So that's an example of artificial passive immunity, whereas artificial active immunity is vaccination. This is where you are infected with a weakened or dead version of a particular pathogen. It's like a little training run. It acts in replacement of the primary immune response. Your body sees this pathogen, it's like, oh my gosh, I've been infected with something, I must immediately have my immune response. But it's kind of a dummy because the pathogen isn't harmful to you because it's dead or it's not capable of reproducing inside your body. So when you have artificial active immunity, you produce the antibodies, you produce the memory cells, and it is a long-term protection. Whereas artificial passive immunity, you're just being injected with antibodies and they will be broken down by your body quite quickly, and it will be a short-term protection. So let's take a minute to focus on vaccination for a bit. Let's just take a minute to read through this description of vaccines. So vaccines take the place of the primary immune response. However, unlike an infection with a normal pathogen, vaccines are not able to cause a disease as they are either dead, inactive, or weakened. Now, how can they be made dead, inactive, or weakened? Well, sometimes they can be exposed to high temperatures, or they can be exposed to high pressures, or they can be put in acidic environments, or a number of other things can be done to them. Vaccines do, however, cause a response from the white blood cells when they recognize the pathogen's foreign antigens. This causes the white blood cells to release antibodies that attack the vaccine. And remember, we talked about how antibodies attack the vaccine. They bind on to the antigen, and they can attract phagocytes, or they can directly kill the pathogen by breaking holes in its cell wall, causing it to burst. When the vaccine has been destroyed, the white blood cells turn into memory cells. These memory cells provide long-term protection because they will trigger the secondary immune response later on. Vaccination is incredibly important. It is one of the biggest things that humans have ever done to protect themselves. Vaccines are safe. Vaccines are extremely rigorously tested before they are used on humans. Vaccines provide us with long-term protection against a series of diseases, especially childhood diseases, and diseases are becoming very rare as a result of vaccine. We're not really very au fait with disease anymore, and we're certainly not au fait with childhood death. Historically, children would die quite regularly. We are so, so lucky to live in a time when we are routinely protected from so many diseases that used to be so dangerous. As a tiny baby, you were injected with the rotavirus vaccine, with the meningitis vaccine. You were injected with a vaccine against diphtheria, hepatitis B, Haemophilus influenza, polio, tetanus, whooping cough. You were vaccinated against measles, mumps and rubella, and you've probably quite recently been vaccinated against HPV, human papillomavirus, which will protect you from cervical cancer. As an adult, you could receive the flu vaccine, you could get the shingles vaccine, you get the pneumococcal vaccine, get the flu vaccine every year, get another pertussis vaccine, a whooping cough vaccine. All these things that you are protected from. It's really, really amazing. So what makes a good vaccine? The first thing is that we need to be able to afford it. Vaccines need to be economically available in sufficient quantity to immunise approximately 95% of the population at risk. We need to be able to introduce herd immunity, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that term, herd immunity, in a bit. So we need to be able to afford it. It needs to be easy to produce, transport, and store. Now, many vaccines often require refrigeration, and this can be problematic. Like, for instance, you've probably heard about the Medina coronavirus vaccine that needs to be stored at very, very low temperatures. And this was really problematic because we had to figure out how we were going to refrigerate it successfully, because if it was allowed to warm, it wouldn't work. And this can be expensive. So we've got to think about the logistics of a vaccine. It needs to use a stable antigen. This means that the antigen won't break down over time. So you could store it in your cupboard or in your fridge, wherever you're going to store it, for a long time, and it wasn't going to change. And also, this means that the antigen on the pathogen is not an antigen on a pathogen which rapidly mutates. So the antigen on this pathogen isn't going to change next year or the year after. If this happens, you have to keep reinventing the vaccine. This is why you need to have the flu vaccine every year. Like you don't have to have the MMR vaccine every year. You have that when you're a kid, you're done. But the flu virus has a high mutation rate. That means that the antigens on its surface change their shape very regularly. The antigen is not stable, and therefore, over time, your vaccine will become less and less effective. So in those situations, either it's a disease for which vaccines aren't really appropriate, or you need to produce a vaccine every year, which can become really expensive. The vaccine has to be easy to administer. I mean, most vaccines are injection-based, and really you want minimal side effects. Everything that you put into your body like that is probably going to have some sort of side effects. Like, for instance, vaccines will often cause people to feel a little bit not very well, might make them feel tired. You know, the point of injection might hurt. It might give them a bit of a fever. They might feel a bit sick. But that is better usually than getting the disease, spreading the disease to other people, and perhaps getting very ill and dying. Vaccines also need to work against all strains of a particular pathogen. So often vaccines will contain more than one antigen to enable it to protect you against more than one strain of a particular pathogen. So what is herd immunity? Herd immunity is when a sufficiently large proportion of the population is vaccinated. This will reduce the spread of the pathogen. The percentage of the population required to be vaccinated varies by mode of transmission and the infectivity rate. So how easily is it transmitted from person to person, and how infective is it? But some diseases like measles, you need to vaccinate between 90 and 95% of the population in order to get herd immunity, essentially in order for the vaccination program to be worthwhile. So getting vaccinated is really important to protect yourself, but being vaccinated just yourself isn't enough. Everyone needs to get vaccinated to protect the whole population, because there are many people that cannot be vaccinated. The very, very young who just haven't reached the age where they can get vaccinated yet. People who are immunocompromised, so for instance, people who have particular autoimmune diseases, or people who have HIV or AIDS, or people who are undergoing chemotherapy or have cancer, or people who are very elderly and vulnerable, often cannot receive the vaccine for particular vaccines. So because of this case that some people cannot get it, everyone else needs to get it so that that pathogen is not present in the population and everyone is protected. So herd immunity is when a high enough proportion of the population is vaccinated so that those who are unvaccinated are protected from the disease. So let's just quickly look, just out of interest, of a couple of diseases and what proportion of the population needs to be vaccinated to develop herd immunity. This is the herd immunity threshold. So we talked about measles already, but let's have a look at something like mumps. Mumps is airborne, and you need to vaccinate between 75 and 86% of the population for the vaccination program to really be successful. Whereas something like flu, you only need to vaccinate maximum of 44% of the population to protect the vulnerable. So it depends on the RO number, which you're probably familiar with from all this talk on the news about coronavirus, the average number of new infections caused by each case in a population where nobody is vaccinated, and the transmission. Okay, so this video has covered some really important information about what vaccines are, how they work, how they protect us, and what a useful vaccine looks like. Well done for listening to that, and I will speak to you soon.